Hello, this is Angela with Parker's Permaculture. I'm standing in the backyard of my Portland, Oregon permaculture garden in Zone 8B. Now, I wanted to talk for a few minutes about weeds in the garden, in particular in my annual veggie garden. Now, if you've watched my channel very much, you know that I emphasize a lot on covering and protecting the soil. Now, there was a documentary done a number of years ago that was like the Back to Eden method. I'm not a subscriber of that. That gentleman had a whole lot of religious symbolism and imagery interwoven into his gardening philosophy that I don't particularly find is, compelling in terms of the realities of ecology and how the garden works. But he did have a really good point, which is that when you cover and protect the soil, that the soil microbiome is able to thrive. So when you have bare earth, you have the rays of the sun baking the soil, desiccating it, and that's not really what we find in nature. What we find in nature is that if we have a healthy, productive ecosystem, that biomass is accumulating on top of the soil and covering and protecting it. And that when you end up with bare baked earth, you end up with desertification, you end up with erosion through wind and water. And so there are all kinds of reasons why it's important to cover and protect your soil. And none of those are particularly religious. If you find that permaculture philosophy, if you find that permaculture design principles interweave well with your own religious practice, that's really, really awesome. But it doesn't mean that effective permaculture design has a religious element to it. So I want to talk really quickly about some weeds out in the garden in my annual veggie bed and how I use them to cover and protect the soil. There are a few tips that I'm going to have here, and I'm speaking predominantly here about annual weeds that come in. You notice nature abhors a vacuum. So we talk about mulch covering and protecting the soil to prevent the baking rays of the sun that desiccate the soil, to prevent wind and water erosion of the soil, but also because open soil is a vacancy into which weeds want to come in and occupy, right? Nature knows that bare open soil is not the way things are meant to go. And so she'll bring in those weed seeds, or the weed seeds that are dormant in the soil. When they have that exposure and they have that ability to germinate and a space to grow, they'll grow. So weeds happen in the garden. I find that they happen less in my garden than in most gardens because I don't have that open soil. I either have a thick layer of mulch where it's hard for weed seeds that settle on top of the mulch to permeate down in and get their roots into the soil itself, or I have living green mulch, as you can see here. And so the weeds are already outcompeted from day one. They don't have a place to fill in. There is no void for them to fill. But when I do get weeds, I want to use them strategically. Weeds are not a problem in my garden. Weeds are a benefit. In permaculture, we say produce no waste. Nothing is a waste. Everything is a resource for which we need to find a use, and weeds are no exception. So let me show you around a little bit and demonstrate what I mean. So I'm feeling pretty jazzed about the way the garden is looking right now, at least this portion of the backyard garden. You can see how much I prefer lushness, right? I want to minimize how much you can actually see the mulch in the beds, because all of this vegetation here in the rain garden and down in my annual beds is providing shade for the soil, reducing water loss. Before I move down into the annual veggie beds, I just want to show you this Veronicastrum, which is looking amazing right now. I pinched it back, basically like a Chelsea chop, but with my fingers, so now it has sent out these side shoots. This is a new Veronicastrum. And you can see there's another one right here. They will come and fill in the rain garden in front of my blue false indigo here. So as we move through the rain garden, here's an example of a weed that I don't want, right? This is a mallow here. It's growing on my little bridge. It's going to be in the way, and it's going to set a ton of seeds. So I'll come back in here and pull it, not right now, but after it rains in the next day or two. Same thing here. In all my gravel I cleaned out earlier, more of this mallow. Always best to weed right after it rains. But as we move in here to where we're actually in a bed, I have all of this volunteer nigella This was here when we bought the house, and it was one of the only, garden flowers that was here, and I let it freely self-sow. So it can get weedy, but if it comes up where I don't want it, I just pull it up and I throw it back on the bed. This is hairy willow herb here. This has to come up. So for me, I'm pulling weeds that I know are going to be a problem once they go to seed. I want to get them early, but that doesn't mean that they don't have a use, right? I'm going to use them and throw them right back on the bed. So let's move over here and I'll give you another look at an example. So this is a bed where I was working just a few minutes ago. I have some young blueberries in here, and I have my good King Henry. And this bed used to be a potato bed, and I had my kids clean it out, and they maybe didn't do the most thorough job. So now I have potatoes as weeds. You can see here. And instead of getting discouraged by how much the potatoes want to take over, I'm just snapping them back and throwing them on the bed. They make great mulch. You can see I put a couple pumpkins in here. Anytime I can shade the soil, here's weeds from last week, put them back on top of the soil and they become mulch. They serve a purpose for me. They are going back and regenerating the soil. They're adding nutrition back into the soil, and they are helping the plants around them. Now, if my weeds are not crowding out, so you notice I've left some potatoes here that are shading and kind of being nurse plants to this baby blueberry. If my weeds are ones that I know don't set a bunch of seed I don't want, and they aren't crowding out the plants I do want, I leave them as a living green mulch. That works just as well for me as pulling them. I'm only pulling them and throwing them back on the bed if there's something that has not yet gone to seed, but I know if it does go to seed, it will be a problem. Or if it's something that is shading a plant that I do want too much. Another example here, euphorbia. And when I pull my weeds, I want to get them all the way at the base, right? I want to get the whole root up. And I want to put the root down so that it gets baked in the sun and my weeds are toast. So now as we move down more into the annual veggie garden, you can see I have almost no ground showing, no mulch showing in my beds. I have all of these self-sowing annuals that I'm going to talk about in a future video that are packed in here along with my veggies. I have a young pumpkin in here, tomatillos in here, tomatoes, and along with those I have all of these other plants that are really crowding out the weeds, so I don't get very much in the way of weeds. I have green mulch that is stuff that I have purposefully put here. It's cultivated, it has outcompeted the weeds, and it does the job of shading the soil. And I do have to be careful. If you look in this bed here, you can see the tomato cages. There are tomatoes in here. There's also volunteers. I kept this kale here, even though it's a little slug chewed. I keep the chard when it self-sows. I intentionally plant pumpkins. That's a tomatillo volunteer, by the way. More chard that just volunteers, and these American flag poppies that have volunteered as well. And here is another intentionally planted pumpkin. No weed competition in here because everything is packed in tight. There's no room for weeds to get a foothold in here. So for me, the weeding that I do in here is basically harvesting greens and cutting flowers to put in a vase on the dining room table. Same thing in this bed. In the spots where I had open soil, I have put dog hair. I have put weeds that I've pulled up to kind of fill in. Very quickly, these squash are gonna fill in. This is my mistake. I accidentally put a summer squash here in amongst my pumpkins. So then I took the opportunity, since I know this won't climb, I took the opportunity to come in here and put some cucamelons in here as well, so that they can take this part of the trellis over, since this squash won't be taking it over. Another example over here is my radishes. I let radishes freely self-sow. If you have a radish plant that has gone to seed, you might think this is a weed that has now come up the next year. I definitely could eat them. The pods are really good. The radishes when they're young are really good. I let them flower for the birds. But in the middle of this, I tend to get a little bit here of nipplewort that tends to always volunteer with my radish. Something about radishes, the nipplewort kind of loves to cohabitate with them. So before these go to seed, you can see here they're just starting to get ready to flower. If my camera will focus for me. Maybe. But it really doesn't want to. Okay. I want to get these before they go to seed. And then again, not a waste. This is a resource that goes right back on the bed. Here's one I pulled a few minutes ago. Another nipplewort. I'm gonna let my radishes go all the way to seed, but I'm gonna pull those nippleworts. Now, I also have some natives in here like breadstraw, Gallium aperine, a good spring herb, native, but I'm just gonna use it as mulch. So for me, everything is a resource, even my weeds. It's just how do you use them to maximize their benefit? I want to shade the soil. If a weed is something that does not set a ton of seed, I will just let it live as a green weed in the garden. If it's something that I know is going to be problematic in the way that it is going to self-sow everywhere, I will remove it before it finishes flowering and can set seed, but then it still goes right back on the bed. I saw someone posting in a couple of garden groups lately, and actually someone commented on one of my videos where I talked about bittersweet nightshade. Someone said, you need to burn that whole plant. No, you don't. You don't need to burn it. You don't want the seeds going in your compost. You don't want to set up cycles of bittersweet nightshade in your garden if it's invasive where you live. But the whole plant is compostable or used as mulch, except for the berries. Just the reproductive part of the plant is what you don't want to have carrying on in your garden. The vegetative parts of the plant, totally fine to use them as either green mulch or brown mulch. So just to reiterate again, we want to make sure that when weeds germinate, if they're a weed that's not pesky, not going to be problematic, not going to set a gajillion seeds in the garden, we want to leave that weed. Let it be a living green mulch that shades the soil. Perhaps it can be a nurse to the baby plants around it. If it is a species of weed that is really heavily self-sowing, has a lot of seeds, we want to pull that weed when it is small before it has had a chance to flower and set seed. But that doesn't mean it needs to be thrown away. It doesn't mean that that weed is somehow unuseful to us. That weed is biomass, and so we're going to toss it back onto the garden bed and use it as mulch around our plants that we do want. When we have weeds that have gone to seed and we don't want those seeds to set up a cycle in our garden and proliferate, I don't know if you can hear my chickens, they're all squabbly back there. Anyway, if we don't want it to proliferate in the garden, we want to make sure that those weed seeds don't end up in our compost. So being really intentional about how we utilize weeds, understanding the life cycle, being really familiar with the species of weeds that we have in our garden. What are we likely to have? What is the growth habit, reproductive habit, and potential usage of our weeds is really important. I hope this video was helpful for you. If you enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up and please consider clicking subscribe. It's really important to like and subscribe videos. It's the most important way that you can help support the work of this channel. If you're interested in other ways to support, you can check those out down below in the description. Thanks so much.